Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to tonight's Oblong Online event for A Sound History, Lawrence Gellert, Black Musical Protest and White Denial by Professor Steven Garabedian. My name is Leif Cantrell, and I am Oblong's Digital and Events Manager, and I will be your tech host for this evening. So before we begin, I just have a couple of housekeeping notes. The first is that you'll notice down in the bottom middle of your screen, there is a Buy the Book button. And if you click on that, it'll bring you to our Oblong Books website with signed copies of Steven's book. My second housekeeping note is that you'll notice right underneath that Buy the Book button, there is an Ask a Question button. And I've noticed that someone already graciously asked a question, which is really great to see right at the beginning of an event. So if at any point tonight during the event you have questions for Steven or Kristin, please feel free to ask them and we will get to them at the end. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Dr. Steven Garabedian is Assistant Professor of History at Marist College and Intern Coordinator of History, Public History, and American Studies. He holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. He is a historian of 20th century US with a research specialization in race, music, and radicalism, and a teaching concentration in US public history and African American studies. He has published articles and reviews in numerous publications and scholarly journals, including American Quarterly, African American Review, and the Hudson River Valley Review. Joining Steven this evening and in conversation is Dr. Kristin Bayer, who is the history chair at Marist College. Dr. Bayer teaches Asian history classes at Marist and holds a PhD in history from New York University. She has also published articles and reviews in many publications, including the International Journal of Pacific Asian Studies, the Hudson River Valley Review, and the Journal of Early Modern History. Welcome, Kristin. I'm going to now pass it over to you to let you conduct tonight's conversation.
Great. Thank you. So, Steve, I think that for historians and researchers and people who are interested in history, it's always exciting and troubling when you discover somebody or encounter somebody that has been sort of taken out of the historical record. More interesting if it's someone who has greatly influenced an era or a genre, an event in history. And I think more interesting still if their narrative is in contrast with the broader narrative that we've been more familiar with. And I think that Lawrence Gellert fits that. So, he's a very interesting character that way. And yet you told me that you wanted to stress that this is not a hero story, but that Lawrence Gellert and the research about him isn't another great white hero. So I'd like for you to elaborate on what you mean by that.
Thank you, Kristin. And I want to say hi to everybody and thank Leif and everybody at Oblong and all of the folks who helped me out at UMass to get the book out and our collaborators at Indiana University and at the Archives of Traditional Music, where the Gellert collection is housed. So Gellert Manuscript Archive and the Gellert Audio Archive is at the Archives of Traditional Music. And as I stressed throughout the book, Gellert has been for decades now subject to quite a bit of mystery and some contention. But there is a public archive available to researchers, and it's been available since the 1980s. So there are opportunities for people to investigate this material on their own. And I do think it's important when I start off talking about Lawrence Gellert to try to deflate any expectations that this is a story about a great white hero as an exceptional figure. I think Lawrence Gellert did some exceptional collecting, and I think he was a very unique and interesting person. But ultimately, his focus, and my focus as well, was on the music of resistance and that he was collecting from everyday African Americans. And his interest was racial justice, not necessarily folklore and preserving musical traditions. He was interested in the cause of racial justice. So I like to highlight it more as a story of allies and allyship, with all of the opportunities that poses, but also some of the risks and contradictions. This is a story about white discoverers and an ongoing Black musical traditions and Black cultural expression. And Gellert himself stressed that he was an intermediary who was just trying to document and draw attention in the dominant culture to this this underground. That's what Sterling Brown referred to it as, an underground tradition of protest. So the possibilities there of cross-racial alliances and allyship are really inspiring, I think, especially for us in the 21st century as we think about racial justice efforts today and allyship and coalitions across lines of social division. But there are also risks involved because of the concurrent tradition of white denial, white racial privilege, and blind spots that have come with some of that. So Gellert was not somehow removed as an enlightened figure from some of the own racial bias and blind spots of some of his white peers and predecessors. They projected some negative racial attributes onto the Black informants that they collected from, certain kinds of exoticism and primitivism and self-pity, for instance. Gellert didn't project that, but he projected revolutionary sentiment in cases. And the Communist Party and the movement around this era of organizing and collecting projected as well some of their assumptions onto what were ordinary people, multidimensional people. So there have been these tendencies to essentialize all along that we would want to be conscious of and resist.
Excuse me. So, that leads us to an obvious question, which is, how did you come across Lawrence Gellert and his archive, Negro Songs of Protest?
The name, by the way, came from Michael Gold of New Masses. He's the one, evidently, who gave it that name. And after Gellert was submitting some of this, these were just lyric transcripts that he was taking down in written notation that he was sending to his older brother Hugo, who had already established himself as a key artist in the communist movement in the Old Left, and was good friends with Gold. So, and that name sounds dated for us in the present, but this is the naming system that was applied at the time and stuck. I came across Gellert's name because I was interested in Black musical protest and white representation, particularly when it came to the blues revival of the 1960s and blues revival authors in the 1960s. I was interested as early as my undergraduate years in American Studies in how white authors, with all of their enthusiasm, nevertheless were romanticizing in some cases, and again, projecting what another historian, George Fredrickson, calls romantic racialism onto some of these individuals from the Black community from whom they were collecting music or locating in the 60s and recording again. Sam Charters, who is one of these figures who published a book that set off, many people said, the search for lost blues singers in the South. And Sam Charters himself, in later years, talked about the romanticizing element in his own effort. And he said, I was trying to draw attention to this, make this appealing. I was thinking about this as a romantic venture. He had good intentions in doing it, and nevertheless, it's something that we want to be aware of. And Gellert's name started to, I guess, trickle into my consciousness through that interest in white representation and Black music making. And particularly in graduate school, it was Michael Denning's book, The Cultural Front, Lawrence Levine's work, and Robin Kelly's book, Hammer and Hoe, I think. These were where I was first seeing Lawrence Gellert's name, particularly Michael Denning's book. There are passages on what he called the political vernacular of the blues, with mentions of Lawrence Gellert and Negro Songs of Protest, which is the name of his field archive, and then ultimately of his first songbook that he published in 1936, which here I have it. Yeah.
So it was in grad school then that you were able to access the archive to.
Yeah, I mean, I saw references to Gellert's name. There was usually not much more than passing references or footnotes. Then I became aware of Bruce Conforth's master's thesis and Bruce Conforth's work, and what were ultimately 3 LPs. From the first one in 1973 came out on Rounder Records, and Gellert was still alive and was involved in that production. And the other 2 came out in the 80s when Gellert was no longer around. But, through interlibrary loan, I requested these as LPs or cassettes. I think I probably just got LPs and then made cassettes. But then when I realized that the material was at Indiana, I went to Indiana for the first time in 1999 and listened through the collection, which had been duplicated onto cassette tape. Listened through the collection, took notes, ordered research copies of the entire collection, and then I was working with it for years. And in the 21st century, I got digitized versions of the entire collection and was able to go through it again just a few years ago in even greater detail.
Okay. You borrow the wording "inventory of falsehoods" as a subsection title in chapter 6, the scholarly rigors chapter. What are the main misconceptions about Lawrence Gellert and the Gellert Field Archive?
I borrowed that wording from a colleague and friend, Matt Callahan, from his book, The Explosion of Deferred Dreams. Inventory of falsehoods I really like. There are quite a few falsehoods, misconceptions about Gellert and the Gellert collection. The first one, which held for years and Gellert was partly responsible for, was that his entire collection was protest. And that is not the case at all. I mean, this is something that Gellert said in the 1960s when he was being interviewed by a really important researcher, Richard Royce. He was interviewed by Richard Royce, and these were recorded on reel-to-reel tapes, and they're at Indiana University as well. Several hours of interviews in the latter part of the 1960s over a period of several years. But he said that. He said, I only got protests. That's the only thing I was interested in. It's not true. A good portion of this body of material that he documented, we're talking about a couple hundred sound discs with songs and song fragments numbering in the several hundreds. And a good portion of it is what we would call non-protest material. It doesn't include any explicit protest lyrics. But he seemed by the 1960s to want to stress and emphasize the protest material in the collection. So he pushed that point, which then is the second falsehood, I think, which is probably very common. And his detractors use this as the allegation against him, is that his archive was so unique that it was suspect, that there were no overlaps with the collections of major predecessors and peers. And that's not true. There are many parallels, and there's quite a bit of overlap to the collections of Howard Odom and Johnson, to material in Dorothy Scarborough's book, to material that the Lomax has collected even. And so including so-called non-protest material. And, you know, making these distinctions for our purposes today makes sense. But, you know, what we would call protest and not is its own interesting conversation, I think, when it comes to this kind of musical expression. So that's another real popular misconception. And the other one maybe would be one that's circulating more currently, which is that you can even see this, unfortunately, on something that reaches a lot of people, if we have to be honest, as a first reference source, Wikipedia. The Wikipedia page on Lawrence Gellert, which is a common point of reference for a lot of people when they're just curious about something they've heard about. References Gellert coaching his informants and fabricating songs. And I've gone through the collection carefully, and the exchanges that I hear and that I try to document some in the book specifically sound to me like absolutely natural exchanges between collector and informant. They do not sound like coaching to me. You can hear sometimes someone saying, that's all there is. That's all there is. Sometimes, you know, he'll say like, okay, we'll start again, you know, because he's trying to get it down, like to get a full verse down or something. But I don't think it sounds like coaching. So I think that's another misconception, a more recent one.
Okay. How and or when did Gellert get into Black folk song collecting? You say his politics developed over time. Can you explain that? But you know, just like we want to know how you got to this, like how do you actually understand Gellert's investment or stake in Black folk song collecting?
Yeah, that's an interesting story, which again I think played into some of the misconceptions and suspicions about Gellert as a propagandist, which is what he was ultimately accused of being, like a communist propagandist who interfered and tampered with the songs he collected, if not actually wrote songs that he tried to present as genuine vernacular material. And the idea in part behind that is we're talking about someone who was a lifelong raging radical who had gone south to collect with an agenda, which is not the case at all. Lawrence Gellert probably ended up relocating himself from New York to Tryon, North Carolina in the winter of 1922. That's as best I've been able to try to determine it. And he went there, as he says, just because he needed rest and relaxation and sunshine because he was having a mental health crisis. He said, I had a nervous breakdown and I had to get away. Had to get away from family pressures up north. He wanted to get out from the shadow of his brother, Hugo, who he said was already a big shot. And he was known as Hugo's kid brother in the cultural left of New York. I think he had aspirations to be an actor or a writer. So he was a romantic and a bohemian, and he wanted to establish himself on his own footing. And he was working as a journalist too. And he said he was working, 7 days a week for hours and hours and hours. So he just needed to get away. He ended up in the South with no knowledge of folk music or interest in folk music. He was sort of innately rebellious and iconoclastic as a person, and he seemed to identify with underdogs, and he likes to stir things up, it seems. So he said he stumbled into Black folk song collecting. It wasn't any kind of agenda on his part. And he did not become politicized in his work until the 1930s. Specifically, he said it took him until the mid 1930s before he really was developing a sense of himself as a music collector, with an explicit political agenda to document Black expressive protest, to counter claims of Black passivity or Black contentment under oppression. So it was a process over time. In some ways, in the book, for instance, I think about it in terms of someone like Langston Hughes, who was an associate of Lawrence Gellert, and wrote what was unpublished but was intended as the front matter to Negro Songs of Protest, where he acclaimed the material as really invaluable. And Langston Hughes was a different person in the 1930s than he was in the 1920s. He politicized along with a shift to the left in the 1930s. And Gellert kind of followed that trajectory, even though he already had some, already seemed to be somewhat rebellious as an individual anyway. He didn't have a political sensibility fully in place, he said, until the 30s.
I think this might be my last question. There are some questions already that are gathering up there. So I'm just curious. You talked about like when you first had access to the archives and materials, you were able to use interlibrary loan to get cassettes or LPs, and then you were able to access digital versions of the recordings. And I'm just curious as to how technology and those changes influenced your ability to understand the recordings or interpret them.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's the digital era, this era that we live in. As I tell students all the time in my public history class too, we're living through this revolutionary era that. If you've been doing historical work, even for a couple decades, you've seen such a dramatic transformation in the possibilities for archival research, because archives have come online, and it makes access so possible in different ways, and manipulation in terms of sound quality. So in this case, initially, we're talking about sound recording discs, 7 and 10-inch recording discs. The 10-inch discs were reported with an electrical portable disc cutter made by the Presto company. And those discs really sound good. So the material that came out on commercial LP, Rounder Records, for instance, and then the two that came out in the 1980s, they sound pretty good. Those were from the 10-inch recordings. The earlier recordings that Gellert made, these 7-inch aluminum discs, the recording quality doesn't hold up at all. And Gellert himself said these were just meant to be one-time shot. They weren't meant for posterity. He was trying to just get something down that he could then transcribe the lyrics, for instance, and send the lyrics to outlets like New Masses. So there was no sense in these days that actual field recordings were going to circulate in mass to a popular or general audience. So these things went from sound discs to tape. And for researchers, when I was at Indiana, they were on cassette tape, and I could get the tape. And of course, yeah, I could play and rewind and play and rewind, but you couldn't work with a digital sound file the way you can now, to try to, raise the treble and lower the bass, or alter the mid-range to try to pick up words better. And so what's really different now is with the digitized recordings that the Archives of Traditional Music has made available. The whole collection's been digitized, but for just for a more casual, curious person, you can go to the Archives of Traditional Music and find audio examples from the Gellert collection, without investing in duplicate copies of 505, songs and song fragments. And that material sounds quite good, those 10-inch recordings especially, but the 7-inch recordings, when I first was listening to them on cassette, a lot of the written inventory, when you'd go through it, prepared by the archives initially in the 80s, it just said like inaudible. And now I listen to all of those 7-inch recordings, and I was able to identify many of them. It's not easy, but you can identify them as presumably earlier versions of songs that he then got later on 10-inch disc. Mm-hmm. So you can find multiple versions of songs he collected, which adds further authentication or verification of the material from different singers, presumably at a different time and place. You can identify some of them as commercial blues. Like he was collecting from an informant who was singing him a song that was already in commercial blues tradition. Sometimes you can't make out all the words, but I could tell what the melody is. So with the careful listen, that technology really has opened things up in many ways. And I would urge anybody who really wants to delve into this to contact the Archives of Traditional Music. Go to the website, listen to the audio examples, and if you really want more, contact them and investigate the collection. I've tried to make cross matches as much as possible, and I've deposited that material with the Archives of Traditional Music as well. But it's fascinating to listen to the collection and to know how it's like a time machine, right? In the way that history nerds, we get excited about this kind of thing, that we're transported in time, and even more effectively with some of this modern technology. I would also say that people can investigate the Richard Royce interviews with Lawrence Gellert too, so you can hear him talking, which again is a kind of time transport. So that's Gellert in the latter part of the 1960s, being interviewed by Richard Royce, a preeminent folk song scholar and historian of the 60s revival, who was studying the revival of the 1930s and 40s. So he was somebody in the 60s folk movement who was looking backwards at the left-wing folk song movement of the 30s and 40s, asking Gellert very pointed questions as they had more and more interviews over time. Like, well, did you fabricate any songs, Larry? No, of course not. Well, where'd you get this song? Where'd you get that song? How do you answer some of these critics? So, and you can hear Gellert in these exchanges. And for some of the folks who might be listening today who know some of this story inside and out about the folk revival, some of those interviews were, I think, done at the Folklore Center, because Izzy Young comes in and out sometimes, and sometimes you can hear banjos or acoustic guitars in the background, as if they might have been doing the interviews at the store. And Izzy Young and Lawrence Gellert were pals at this time. Gellert had relocated to New York City. He lived at 148 Sullivan Street from the 50s. At some point, he relocated in the 50s. So all the way until he disappeared in 1979, he lived at that apartment. And in the 60s, he would hang around the Folklore Center. He would go book buying with Izzy Young. And so they palled around some.
Okay, so maybe we should turn to the questions.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Steven, for walking us through some of your research. We do have a lot of questions, so I'm excited to get right into those. So, Proctor wants to know, did Bruceforth have access to the same archives, UMass, Indiana, that you did? I'm trying to sort out the differing conclusions that Mr. Conforth and you reached. Conforth characterizes Gellert, for example, as apolitical. In my understanding, I have not read your book, but you commented earlier that this evening that Gellert had strong views about racial equality and justice.
Yes, that's a smart, fair question. So absolutely, Bruce Conforth had access to these materials. He was one of the pioneering people who brought this material to everyone's attention because he was at Indiana University at the archives. So he was the one who really dove into this initially. And what's interesting is that his initial conclusions were that Gellert was a really important radical folklorist. And his work in putting out the two collections, the LP collections in the early 80s, were to establish Gellert as a radical folklorist who was a contemporary of the Lomaxes, who collected far more protest content than the Lomaxes. And so it was surprising to me in Conforth's biography of Gellert from 2013 that he has in effect reversed his position on Gellert's political sensibility and the reliability of the archive. Conforth now holds that much of the Gellert collection that is non-protest is valuable and important and reliable, but the protest material, he says, is suspect, and he thinks it's tainted and shows the fabrication of a propagandist. And I disagree. We're using the same primary source materials, and my analysis differs from his, and I simply try to document the primary source material and make my case. One thing that I mentioned in the book, the question says that the person hasn't been able to read the book yet, but one of the examples that I use in the book about Gellert's political sensibility that runs counter to Bruce Conforth's is Bruce makes the case that in a particular article, Lawrence Gellert never uses the word protest, and that the wording of protest was applied artificially from left-wingers to his material, and he just went along with it because he saw it as a career move. And I use that same article to say, look, the word protest is literally in this article. You can see the word protest in the article, and along with words about insurrection and revolution in the article. So my argument is that Lawrence Gellert was using the word protest and was deliberate about it because he was somebody committed to the movement. As late as his interviews in the 60s, he was still saying that socialism is a superior system to capitalism and would prevail someday. So I think he adhered to his political sensibilities even through the Cold War, when he continued to publish on the left. It was an outspoken person through the Cold War, which was quite a risk, is what I try to establish as well in the book. It's not a casual move you would make.
Thank you so much for that. Our second question is from Dick, who would like to know, do you think that there were other Black music scholars who have been ignored because they either didn't have academic credentials or their work contradicted prevailing wisdom?
Yes, absolutely. There are a number of important collectors from the African-American community who, in some ways, like Gellert didn't have any formal credentials or academic affiliations or institutional affiliations even. The Lomaxes ultimately were affiliated with the Library of Congress and had academic standing with their peers. People like, I was just talking about this recently, people like Thomas Talley at Fisk University collected Black folk song material. but he was a scientist on the faculty there, and seems to have been passed over by people in terms of attention and the spotlight. We think about John Wesley Work, the father and son, who were important collectors. And, people are aware of these folks, but do they get the same attention as the Lomaxes, for instance? I don't think so. Lewis Wade Jones, who was involved along with Alan Lomax collecting in Mississippi, who we could say does not get the attention deserved. Willis Lawrence James, who also was involved in a lot of important work collecting and promoting Black folk song material, whose name is also not in wide circulation in the same way that one might hear about the Lomaxes in the Library of Congress. Again, this doesn't mean that these folks have been completely ignored, but do they get the same spotlight? And somebody who's really fascinating is Zora Neale Hurston, who was highly critical, for instance, of some white collectors for getting it all wrong, as she said. Like, she was highly critical of Howard Odum and Guy Johnson for getting it all wrong. And she complained about that in correspondence, for instance, to Langston Hughes. Now she's widely acclaimed for her work, but I would say more for her literature, her fiction, than necessarily people are fully aware of Mules and Men from 1935. That's an incomplete answer, but it's an attempt.
Is it possible, John would like to know, is it possible to listen to any of the Gellert recordings online?
Yes, absolutely. So everybody, you could go to two places actually right away. You could go to the Archives of Traditional Music website with a Google search. You can find audio examples from the Gellert collection, which are examples that they prepared in consideration of the book. So some of the particular audio examples that I highlight in the book are available to listen to at the Archives of Traditional Music. And my publisher as well, UMass, has a digital supplement that you can find, Garabedian, A Sound History, and you can find a digital supplement which has these audio examples as well as some of the writing from the book to contextualize it a little bit. So yeah, people can hear them right away. And even before all this formal work that was done on behalf of the collection, there were already a few things circulating, like at YouTube, for instance. You can find, there was Mr. Tyree, somebody had put up at YouTube, which is one of the guitar blues from the Gellert collection. I remember seeing that at some point come online. So there are a few places where you can hear this material, yes, right away.
So I love this next question. Andrea would like to know, Steve, can you speak to the breakdown of gender within Gellert's collection? Was this exercise predominantly capturing a Black male perspective?
Yes. It was, he was collecting, like many of these collectors of this time, he was collecting from prisoners at different penal institutions in the South. And he was collecting primarily from male prisoners. There are, on occasion, some female voices in the collection, but by and large, it is African-American men that we're hearing represented. I mean, that's interesting and valuable to mention. There are some prison recordings, comparable prison recordings, that are out, collected by a peer of Lawrence Gellert, Herbert Halpert, who collected some, and I write about this a little bit in the book, from Black female prisoners in a Southern penitentiary in Mississippi. And one of the songs in that collection that I write about, Dangerous Blues, is a song of retribution from one of the women, talking about, you asked me to do this and that, you expect this of me, you better watch out. I'm going to be dangerous if you don't watch out. Which then corresponds to a lot of the women's blues of the 1920s, where there were songs of retaliation or retribution for male assault, male violence, sexual assault, and abuse. So it's interesting, but it is largely men in the collection, whose male voices, I should say.
Thank you for that. Nicholas would like to know, is there any way to tell how far back these songs go? In other words, are some of the recordings versions of songs that were originally composed in some form back in the 19th century? Yes,
I think so. Absolutely. There are these stock lines that circulate in this communal tradition that can be traced back, and some of Lawrence Gellert's peers who have material that parallels what's in his collection identify some of these either stanzas or lines that you can trace back in tradition. But then there are also lines that seem very contemporary to the moment, which is why it's a cool question, because it allows us to think about this. This is another reason why Gellert's material fell into some disrepute after what we would call like a vogue in the 30s and 40s. As academic folklore was taking hold in institutional settings after World War II for the first time, there was an understanding in the field that for music to be characterized as folk, it had to be in communal tradition, and that it had to have an anonymous lineage that could be traced back in time and place. And Gellert openly said, like, I could care less if the song was sung once or many times. If it's a folk song, I don't care. He said, like, I don't know what a folk song is. I don't think any of these people actually know what a folk song is either. If someone's singing it and I think it's valuable, I want to take it down, period. And so part of the dispute in the language of that field would be, are these songs of protest or are these folk songs? And can they be both? And Gellert said, I could care less. I'm documenting what I'm hearing. And I think it's important to hear the voices of the oppressed and these voices of resistance. And that's all that mattered to him, really. And what I've been able to do for some of these songs that were dismissed as maybe like one-time creations, nonce creations is what one of the folklorists in the Journal of American Folklore called them. Like, oh, I think these are nonce creations, just sung once for him by an African-American Southerner who was politicized. Well, I was able to say, like, well, some of these songs, no, he's got multiple recordings from different people over time. So they're clearly not just a nonce creation, a one-time creation. And it's important to say that the Lomaxes and other collectors were not necessarily scientific throughout their careers either, especially in the early years when these things weren't formalized yet. So, and they recombined verses and did all these kinds of things in their songbooks were criticized for it early on, by the way. Yeah.
Our next question is from Elijah, who would like to know, my impression is that a lot of people first heard about Gellert through Josh White's popular and popular front recording Chain Gang. Do you know what Gellert thought about that project and popularization?
Yeah, it's a good question. That gets to some of the wrinkles in the Gellert story. Clearly, some of the reasons why I don't think I'm not interested in writing necessarily hero stories. I think humanity's too imperfect for that. So Gellert did find himself in conflict with a lot of important people in the during the folk boom of the 1960s and in the folk music community going back to the 30s and 40s. And he did talk about Josh White recording his songs on, and that is really not sound and not responsible in the sense that Josh White, an African-American Southerner, was part of a community and a culture where this music was part of an insider world, whereas Gellert was an outsider who was documenting things. So it's a little strange that Gellert would be thinking about some of the, like having a sense of proprietary rights over something like that. And he's full of contradictions because he was also angry when he was trying to deposit his material at the Library of Congress, because he said, well, you can't put this under my name because I didn't write these songs. You've got to come up with some other way to indicate that I'm simply the person who documented this. And so he was sort of arguing for both ways, depending on the circumstances. He was very excited when Harry Belafonte in the 60s recorded Look Over Yonder on one of his albums, because he said, I'm going to make money off of that. And because that's a song that has my name attached to it, and he had some copyright claim to it, the arrangement. So what was happening is, in that period, this is something that makes him similar to Alan Lomax, even though they're frequently shown to be rivals, as particularly John Lomax and Lawrence Gellert. He seemed to have more ambiguous feelings about Alan, the son. But Alan Lomax and Lawrence Gellert, at periods in their lives, were trying to find a way to pursue their work and make a living. And neither one was living high on the hog at these periods in their lives. So Gellert also published a book of lost plays by Eugene O'Neill, which seemed to be particularly irresponsible. And this was unwelcome by the O'Neill interests. And so that seems like a pretty inappropriate move as well. So he was certainly not perfect at all. So we have to be credited for, strengths and weaknesses when it comes to things like this.
This is our last question so far. So if any of you are out there listening and have more questions, now would be the time to write them out. From Peter, who would like to say, thank you for presenting on this fascinating topic. You mentioned that the music Gellert collected was singular, with little overlap compared to other contemporary collections. Could you provide some specifics on the songs and musicians he gathered?
Peter, I will make sure that we it's understood. I said the accusation is that the Gellert collection is singular and without overlap or parallel. That's one of the common allegations used to call the material into question. But in fact, there are some striking songs in the collection, but there is also a lot of parallel. It is not singular and entirely unique as a collection. So that's important because there are elements of overlap that help us to corroborate the collection as reliable. So Gellert did not take down names of any of the singer informants that he documented, either in written transcription or on sound recordings. And this, again, was another reason why eventually some of his detractors said the material was suspect. He didn't take it down any names. Where did the stuff come from? I think he made it up, was the allegation. And so what Gellert said was, of course, I didn't take down names. I was collecting sensitive material. They did not want their names attached to it in the U.S. South under Jim Crow. And I believe that. I also think, as he said in his interviews to Richard Royce, but I also was not systematized in my collecting. And he was acknowledging I was sloppy. I think that's part of it, because I didn't care that much. I was like caught up in the movement, and my goal was political, not preservation. He wasn't thinking as a folklorist. He was thinking as a cultural worker in an activist movement. So it's important, I think, to stress that in a kind of noble sense. He was protecting the anonymity of these singers as because of the sensitivity of the material, but in a less noble sense, I think he was just haphazard in that sense and just gathering it and moving on. So we don't have the names of anyone. At the very end of the book, I identify some field recordings in the Gellert collection where the informant singer sounds a lot like a singer or a group of singers in some John Lomax field recordings for the Library of Congress from 1934 that were collected in Georgia, which is also where Gellert was spending a lot of time collecting. And so that's some of the audio example material that people can listen to through the Archives of Traditional Music, and you can read about in the book.
Awesome. So we have a follow-up question from Elijah, and I think this will probably be our last question for the evening since we're coming right up on 8. Thank you so much, Kristin and Steven. You've both been excellent. Elijah's follow-up question is, both you and Bruceforth seem to concentrate on the lyrics Gellert collected, as did Gellert, but it seems like no one talks about the extraordinary and in some ways unique guitarists he recorded, at least a couple of them real virtuosos. Do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think it's an entirely different element of the collection, which is fascinating. And there are, this is the Elijah that I'm guessing it is, there are experts who can identify and contextualize that material better than me. We don't have any names attached, but yes, some of the guitar blues and the instrumental virtuosity that you can hear on these field recordings from the 30s, it's really fascinating. And you know, it would be wonderful to know who these people are. I don't, and Gellert's left no trail. So it's difficult. I mean, you know, people can speculate, but there's nothing I think that can be definitive at this point. It's a whole nother question about the way in which researchers like me and others really do focus on lyric texts when they talk about protest. But of course, cultural resistance and resistance through the arts need not always be expressed in words. It can be, you know, it can be expressed other ways through the music itself. It's not something I go into in the book, but I think it's a fascinating subject. People should listen to that material in the that is available, definitely.
Well, thank you both so much. I have learned so much this evening, and I'm sure our audience members have as well. We have lots of thanks, and a good night for the Marist History Department in the chat. So thank you both so much. And to all our audience members out there, if you're interested in getting a signed copy of A Sound History, it's available online at oblongbooks.com. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, everybody. And yeah, I'll give a shout out to the History Department at Marist College as well, where I had enormous support. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Have a great night.
Good night.